Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Kelly Combs. I'm a partner in the FDA regulatory practice at Ropes & Gray and co-chair of the firm's cross-practice digital health initiative. I'm joined today by two of my partners, Christine Moundis, who is a partner in the healthcare practice group and also a co-chair of the digital health initiative, and Mike Beauvais, who is the immediate past global co-chair of our healthcare and life sciences industry group. Today, we'll be talking about the digital health investments and the deal-making landscape. Just a few housekeeping items before we kick it off. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. Although the phone lines won't be open, you can feel free to use the Q&A function through the Zoom webinar platform. Additionally, after the presentation, we'll be circulating an email with a thank you note and a recording for all of those who attended. Moving on now to the agenda. We have a very packed agenda for you today. We'll start with a brief overview of the digital health deal-making landscape, then discuss some key federal and state regulatory developments impacting the digital health space, move on to talk about diligence considerations in digital health, and finally wrap up with a discussion of digital health growth opportunities. With that, I'll turn it over to Mike to kick us off with a discussion of the digital health deal-making landscape.
Terrific. Thank you, Kelly. So we're going to go to the next slide, please. Terrific. So the next few slides are kind of just set the stage for the state of digital health coming out of Q1 and going into Q2. So what you see on this slide is just really a rip from the headlines, right? A couple key takeaways. So digital health funding shattered previous records with $6.3 billion in just the first half alone of 2020. We have in the top left, Teladoc's $18.5 billion deal with Livongo and several others. So why is this happening? Two key trends. One, the relaxation requirements. So everything from reimbursement, privacy, licensure, FDA, things that we'll hit in the later part of this presentation, as well as the shifting of demand, right? So we had hospitals filling up on the ICU stage. We had telehealth and remote patient monitoring driving volume outside of the hospitals. And we have the point of delivery of care switching as well. We could go to the next slide, please. Thank you, Kelly. So here you can see, looking at the left, from the left to the right, that in the first quarter of 2020, we had $5.4 billion of digital health funding, which is crushing where we were even in previous years. You can see in 2019, we had $7.4 billion for the entire year. The other key data point is the average deal size actually increased quite dramatically. In 2019, you had $19.5 million as the average deal size, and that has increased in just this first half of the year to $25.1 million. Next slide, please. Again, just talking about just from a funding perspective, here's just, it's not an exhaustive list, but a representative list of the types of deals we're seeing. We're certainly seeing pharmacy, digital pharmacy and prescription companies raising significant funds. We see in Oscar Health and others, virtual care services receiving dramatic increases in funding. Amwell, formerly known as American Well, raised $194 million. There's also publicly disclosed last week that they're filing an IPO. Google did an investment, so you're seeing a lot of the large data companies making investments, huge investments in the space, quite a bit in the AI-driven drug discovery platforms, typical software platform developers for patient management, companies like Tempus that are redefining how genomic data is being used, and then kind of your more traditional, in quotes, physician-generated healthcare data companies like Verana. So next slide, please. And the M&A deal activity, again, incredibly robust. Even in this, usually the summer months have a little bit of a slowdown. That certainly wasn't the case for July and August, as we've seen both at the small and large transactional level. In the first half of this year, we had 83 digital health companies being acquired. Again, a few representative examples. We're seeing a lot of add-on, bolt-on acquisitions. You had Teladoc doing the InTouch Health acquisition for $650 million. Again, we mentioned the $18.5 billion Teladoc acquisition that they just announced recently. Optum getting into the mix as well, Walmart, and a few other data privacy solution providers. So as we sit here, as a large firm with quite a few lawyers, we are seeing increasing levels even in August and September on the deal front. Private equity, which some of the private equity firms had a little bit of a slowdown in the second quarter, we're starting to see those activities pick up dramatically. So I'm quite optimistic for Q2, and we'll see what Q4 brings. Next slide, please, Kelly. Thank you. Digital health IPOs. Again, the IPO window remains quite robust. Here's a couple representative transactions. GoHealth is an insurance. Again, Amwell, I mentioned previously in the telehealth space, they've now publicly announced GoodRx, which is a pharmacy, mail-order pharmacy business, among others. So again, all indications are the capital markets remain very much receptive. Valuations are an all-time high, particularly those with a software component versus a pure services component. So again, who knows what the election will bring? That's kind of the wild card, but based upon at least conversations with bankers and other sources, the general feeling is if you can get out before the election, great. And even if during the election, the typical IPO windows will remain as is. Who knows, right? We could all predict the markets, but certainly something that we're watching. Next slide, please. Just for the vernacular, one of the things, particularly people that may be of a certain vintage like myself, had been around for a little bit, they used to be called blank check preferred companies, but we are seeing quite a bit of activity in the SPAC market. SPACs are special purpose acquisition companies. 52% of all IPOs last year across all healthcare and technology sectors were SPACs. What SPACs are essentially, you get a pool of money from one or more sponsors, usually around $100 million. They then have a mandate. They get to go around and try to buy an interesting company. And the theory is, and I think it's proved true, is as opposed to a traditional IPO, which has some market risk and the like, SPACs go around and find a specific target. There's a whole process. There's a shareholder approval requirement. They're kind of their own unique animal. But the point is that for someone who is at a company or interested in a company that is private but thinking about accessing the public markets, SPACs are something that have been roaring back at the end of last year, but in particular this year, as a real true alternative to doing an IPO. So again, as we kind of think about the deal landscape and what we're seeing, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention at least what's happening in the SPAC market as well. And there's two examples on slide number 9. Why don't we go to the next page, please? Terrific. So I'm going to turn this over to my colleagues, Kelly and Christine, and I'll be back later on to talk about some other kind of traps for the weary that we're seeing in the deal market. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Hi, I'm Christine Moundis. As I said, I'm a healthcare partner in the New York office, and I co-lead the Digital Health Initiative with Kelly. So what we want to do in this presentation, Mike gave the macro view of how digital health, the industry has heated up so tremendously on the investment side and some of the macro factors that have led into that. What we want to do is do a slightly deeper dive into a few of the particular trends, both in terms of sort of technologies or methods for delivery of telehealth, different contexts, or digital health, different contexts in which it's been deployed, and some recent trends that have impacted that. And then we'll later go into some of the regulatory shifts that have underpinned that growth. So as Mike had referenced, the use of telehealth services obviously has surged in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the statistics that was really eye-popping that came out earlier this year is if you looked at April of this year to April of last year, there was telehealth claims increased over 8,000%. So that was sort of early point of the pandemic within the US. It just showed this explosion and this conversion of the way healthcare was being delivered in this country. And more than 9 million Medicare beneficiaries used telehealth during the early stages of the pandemic. So again, this is really just enormous numbers that we're witnessing in response to the pandemic, and obviously something that was going to create shifts in the market and the thinking around digital health and digital health investment. Next slide. So obviously this shift has happened because of COVID, and it was already, the groundwork had been laid, but then this really spurred on this tremendous shift to telehealth. But we believe that because this shift has happened and now people are getting familiarized with the technology and providers getting more comfortable with it, and there's more of a IT infrastructure now being put around it, that telehealth will become increasingly used even post-COVID, whenever that is. So we think it's going to become increasingly accessible to the public, particularly as it becomes integrated more into mobile health applications. And we think that this market, there are projections that the market could actually grow sevenfold by 2025. So when you think of those statistics and what that means for all the companies in the telehealth ecosystem, whether it be telehealth providers themselves, platforms that support it, mobile apps that integrate it, providers that use it, it really, there are downstream consequences for this entire digital health market that we need to think through. And again, there's been projections that $250 billion of the current US healthcare market could be potentially virtualized. So we will see if that occurs, but there's definitely a lot of very strong trends that are indicating that that might be the case. So that's on the telehealth front. Kelly, can you move to the next slide? The other scenario, we wanted to think about another scenario for you in which digital health is really, has shifted and will continue to shift in a way that's important for life sciences companies. That would be remote clinical trials and the way that life sciences companies have had to shift to make sure that they can continue their clinical trials in a remote environment. So decentralized remote clinical trials, that's a scenario where there's no centralized research facility. The research could be conducted out of a participant's home with some local healthcare resource. It often operates through telemedicine and often leverages mobile devices and smart devices. So there's different models here. You know, the subject visits could take place in the person's home through mobile health providers. It could take place in the person's home through telemedicine, or there could be no subject visits and there could just be sort of remote collection of data through smart devices. So again, this is a shift that had started to occur, but now it's really accelerating, and companies in the life sciences and clinical trial ecosystem are thinking about these shifts. Next slide. So the experience with remote clinical trials during COVID could have implications for clinical trials in the future, right? Again, as people are shifting out of necessity now, it might actually get them more familiar and more comfortable with just using this as the default mode of conducting clinical trials moving forward. So as long as they figure out, you know, how to use telehealth, what regulations they need to think about, how do they create these home visits to make sure that they can visit subjects when needed, how do they obtain patient consent electronically, how do they leverage these smart devices to monitor patients, all of that, the practice now in the context of this pandemic may facilitate, you know, the use of these technologies post-pandemic. Okay, I will turn it over to Kelly. I think you're going to talk about another subset of digital health that we wanted to explore.
Great, thanks, Christine. So we want to spend a few minutes talking about the intersection of digital health and pharma. And when we talk about pharma here, we mean broadly pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical device industry. And what we've seen is that, you know, there's really been a shifting focus toward identifying health issues early on, and also finding innovative ways to assist patients and their healthcare professionals in actually managing a condition. And this has been particularly common to see digital health solutions related to the management of chronic conditions. What we've seen over the last several years is biotech, pharma, and medical device companies developing their own digital solutions and also collaborating with traditional software companies to develop companion apps and other sorts of digital products. Just a few examples here on the screen. Many of the digital health solutions that we've seen recently relate to medication selection and adherence. I already mentioned disease management, and Christine has talked about telehealth. But just in general, these digital health solutions that are becoming increasingly more popular, as I mentioned, are really to help the patient and the patient's healthcare professional manage a particular disease or chronic condition over the course of time. In terms of the types of technology that we're seeing, we're also seeing a wide variation. Mobile apps and clinical decision support software are probably the two most common technologies that Christine and I have worked with lately. There are, of course, a variety of other technologies in play, including connected devices, wearables, and so on. On the next slide here, just to provide some examples of some of the more interesting initiatives that we're aware of, I mentioned mobile medical apps and clinical decision support tools. There are a variety that are already in the public domain. Valentis Alina is an app that enables symptom management and remote care for patients with cancer, and that app has actually received FDA clearance. Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson both have tools that are designed to help individuals manage life. In Pfizer's case with cancer, and in Johnson & Johnson, all sorts of tools to help patients manage their condition, including medication reminders, refills, and appointments. Connected devices are also a really interesting area of innovation. For example, the Bayer Beta Seron app, My Beta app, connects actually with a Bluetooth-enabled auto-injector. So when a patient administers the injection for the product, it is then recorded in the app, and that information can then be transmitted to the patient's healthcare professional. Abilify's MySight is what's known as a smart pill. That product has a sensor within it that connects to a patch that the patient wears on her body, and then provides information to an app that again can be provided to a healthcare professional. This, it can be used essentially to monitor patient adherence to her medication regimen. There are also e-prescribing, e-authorization, e-couponing platforms such as Cover My Meds, and Express Scripts has a very interesting digital health formulary where patients, pharmacists, and doctors evaluate digital health solutions and recommend them for addition to the formulary. Another interesting development that we've seen just over the last couple of years relates to consumer-facing healthcare. Consumer-facing healthcare is when patients are interacting directly with and determining the nature of their health services that they may be receiving. And this is really consistent with a broader trend that we've seen in industry and also at FDA to emphasize patient centricity. What is the patient's role in designing her healthcare and her treatment regimen? The involvement of the traditional healthcare professional is limited or eliminated altogether in these consumer-facing healthcare technologies, and technology is absolutely central to the entire offering. So what we've seen are a number of online platforms as well as a number of mobile apps to help consumers or patients get more involved in their treatment decisions. There are a variety of trends to consider here, and I won't go through them all in the interest of time. But as I mentioned here, there is really an emphasis on consumer choice and convenience. Many of the entrants we're seeing in this space are naive to the healthcare space, to the life sciences space, and to in particular the regulatory issues that are associated with developing products in these markets. We are now having to apply traditional regulatory frameworks and concepts to very non-traditional and innovative activities. And we've seen some challenges from traditional healthcare providers and other stakeholders given the rapid evolution in this space. On the next slide, just to provide a little bit more information about consumer-facing healthcare, as I mentioned, this rise in consumer centricity and convenience-oriented care has really been at the center of this trend. A number of technological improvements as well as changes to state laws now allow patients to be treated over the internet or via mobile applications in ways that were not possible before. And now we have a variety of startups really kind of taking different approaches to help diagnose, prescribe, and treat patients remotely. And with that, I'll turn it over to Christine to talk about some key federal and state regulatory developments.
Thanks, Kelly. So as we said, we wanted to highlight for you all some core trends in this digital health space. It's not comprehensive, but it's a good slice of different issues that we're seeing percolate and really drive the market here. As we said, you have the business trends, but then you also have the regulatory landscape that underlies those shifts. And in the telehealth space, we have seen a tremendous shift in the way telehealth is regulated in the COVID pandemic context. I don't think I've ever seen in my career a shift in laws that was so sudden and so widespread, and something that had to be tracked really by the hour. So in telehealth, you have regulation of licensure and the provider classes. You have licensure or regulation around modalities and location. You have a whole regulatory overlay around the reimbursement, and then privacy and security. We had the pre-COVID lay of the land in terms of how all that was regulated. Then we had a total shift for the purposes of the COVID-19 pandemic and how urgent it was from a public health perspective to make telehealth more widely available. And then we have really what is the post-COVID-19 impact of this? What is it going to leave? What imprint will it leave on the market moving forward? So in the pre-COVID-19 pandemic space, you had a very tightly regulated framework where you had in-state licensure, limited classes of providers that could provide care through telehealth. Prescribing was tightly controlled. You had only particular types of equipment that qualified for telehealth, different geographic restrictions. And then in the reimbursement space, you had limited coverage under Medicaid, Medicare. Commercial payers were sort of all over the map, I'd say. And then in privacy and security, you had a very sort of rigid framework that really harkened back just to the usual HIPAA business associate type domain. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the issuance of all the different public health emergency orders, what happened is on a state-by-state basis within the US, each governor and or legislature basically changed or waived their laws overnight in order to loosen up the framework so that telehealth could be provided across state lines for out-of-state licensure. If there was one particular state, New York, the Northeast got hit hard in the early days of the pandemic. So having providers from other states being able to provide telehealth into the state was very useful. There was really allowing most providers to provide telehealth services, really open up the classes of providers that are providing telehealth, add some flexibility to the prescribing, what was allowed, because that was obviously something that needed to be loosened up as well. And then many new modalities were added in terms of acceptable telehealth technologies. Medicare and Medicaid shifted their coverages, so did the commercial payers. And then even on the privacy and security front, the federal regulator said for at least the period of the pandemic, they were going to allow for non-HIPAA compliant technology use, just given the fact that some providers needed to urgently contact their patients and had to do so through FaceTime rather than a really approved telehealth app. So, we are in a period of unprecedented loosening of the regulations in this telehealth space. It probably will not stay like this forever, right? A lot of those waivers are in effect for the pendency of the public health emergency or the pandemic. But we think what's going to happen post-COVID is that some of those relaxations of requirements will remain in place. So some licensure requirements may remain looser for a longer period of time. Provider classes may continue to be broad. And even things like the reimbursement, now that these things have been put in place, people are getting more comfortable with them, it might continue to stay in a much more telehealth friendly posture moving forward. Next slide. So just to, again, talk about some of the telehealth regulatory and legislative developments, there have been a lot of different bills passed, and it's sort of a continuous process now of monitoring that, where you have the Connect for Health Act of 2019, which was a bipartisan bill introduced even before the pandemic that would have removed certain payer restrictions. Then you had the Health Act, which was just a few months ago, that was arguing to make permanent some of the Medicare payments for telehealth services at federally qualified health clinics. And then you had the CMS proposed rule just recently for the Medicare physician fee schedule, which proposes to add new Medicare reimbursable telehealth services. So really the takeaway here is there's a lot of momentum and a lot of support for keeping telehealth at the forefront even post-pandemic. Next slide. Then thinking about the regulatory landscape for remote clinical trials, just some of the things that need to be thought about usually, and then that need to be looked at in particular as companies are adopting and pushing out remote clinical trials in more of a real way. There's electronic informed consent requirements, and we'll talk a little bit about how the FDA has tried to enable providers to have an easier way to obtain those informed consents. There's data privacy considerations here. Again, unclear how some of the relaxation of requirements in just the telehealth space might actually be sort of borrowed over in this remote clinical trial space. You have your human subjects research regulations. For the most part, those have not shifted dramatically in the context of this pandemic, but something to keep in mind. And then you have, home visit considerations, fraud and abuse considerations, and others. Next slide. So in the context of the pandemic, informed consent flexibilities were passed. So there are ways now to send consent forms via fax or email and have the subject actually sign them on a remote basis. And it's required that the IRB actually review and approve these different procedures. But in a show of the federal government really supporting this shift, the FDA made its My Studies app available to investigators as a free platform to obtain electronic informed consent securely. So that was something we had companies scrambling to figure out how to shift to this electronic informed consent paradigm. And then the FDA actually came out and said, hey, you can use our app. So I think that's a very good indication that the federal government is getting behind that shift. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over. Those were just, again, little examples of how the pandemic has shifted the regulatory framework. Kelly's now going to talk about the FDA regulatory landscape on the digital health front.
Great, thanks, Christine. An understanding of the FDA regulatory landscape is absolutely critical to investing in the digital health space, particularly given that many companies, software companies or other companies focused on digital health solutions are either pretty young companies or maybe new to operating in a highly regulated industry. Critically, FDA regulates software and other digital health products that meet the definition of medical device. As a practical matter, the agency has adopted a number of policies over the years and really take a tiered approach to enforcement. It's a very complicated framework. FDA has done most of its policy making through guidance documents that come out in draft form after which industry and other stakeholders have an opportunity to comment. And there are a number of guidance documents that have been issued over the years relating to a variety of topics, including general wellness apps. So apps that are really intended for the general population and help patients or consumers manage sleep, manage their diet, know if they're getting enough exercise, just for general wellness purposes. There are also guidance documents or policies related to artificial intelligence in medical devices. There are guidance documents related to mobile medical applications, clinical decision support software, and many more. As a general matter, FDA incorporates principles related to functionality of the device's intended use, and the level of risk associated with the digital health technology in determining how the agency will regulate a particular digital health solution. If the device is known or the digital health solution is determined to be low risk to patients if it were to malfunction, in general, then FDA exercises what it calls enforcement discretion. So even if, as a technical legal matter, the digital health technology meets the standard or definition for regulation as a medical device, if it's low risk to patients, FDA exercises enforcement discretion and doesn't enforce a variety of regulatory obligations that would ordinarily apply to digital health manufacturers. On the other hand, for digital health solutions that are seen as higher risk to patients, so if an app doesn't function the way it's intended, if there's a mistake built into the algorithm of the app and so on, would there be a significant risk to patients? In that case, FDA exercises what it calls strict regulatory oversight. Most importantly, regulatory oversight. So for this category of devices for which FDA is exercising regulatory oversight, FDA may require, among other things, pre-market authorization in the form of, for example, a 510(k) clearance before a company can actually market that digital health solution. As a result, and we'll talk about this later in the presentation, it's absolutely critical during the diligence process to understand how FDA is going to be regulating a particular product, because if it is in fact regulated in a way that, according to FDA policy, requires strict regulatory oversight, then you would need some sort of pre-market authorization. And although we have seen a number of companies get 510(k) clearance for mobile medical apps and clinical decision support software tools, there are still, I think, a lot of newness to FDA's policy and a lot of companies that may be lagging behind. In addition to the pre-market authorization requirement, it's also important to consider other FDA regulatory requirements, including those related to how the app is marketed, as well as how it's made, and then finally adverse event reporting. So if something goes wrong with the app, if the patient has an adverse experience, how is that information tracked and then potentially reported to FDA? Just like we've seen in the telehealth and remote clinical trial context, we've seen a deregulatory trend at FDA as well. This deregulatory trend is not new. It's long-standing and has been the case now for many years, but we've really seen consistency in how FDA is regulating and approaching digital health technology in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. The agency has issued a variety of guidance documents over the last several months, including guidance documents related to remote monitoring devices, digital pathology devices, digital health devices for treating psychiatric disorders, as well as a policy that applies specifically to electronic thermometers that may capture and ultimately share data. FDA has also provided a number of examples of how specific COVID-19 digital health solutions may be regulated by FDA. So I'm sure many of you have seen symptom checkers, contract tracing apps, other digital health solutions that help you determine, for example, should you be going to work? Should you be quarantining? Should you be sending your child to school and so on? And FDA has, not in a formal policy, but on an FAQ page on their website, provided some guidance about how to approach the regulatory analysis and classification issues when it comes to those sorts of products. Then I mentioned earlier that FDA distinguishes between lower risk digital health technology and higher risk digital health technology to determine how strictly they want to regulate that product. FDA has invited developers of higher risk digital health tools that are specifically intended for use in connection with COVID-19 to engage with FDA directly. And in our experience working with many clients who have worked to engage FDA on issues like this, we have found FDA to be very collaborative and to be very timely in the responses. So if at any point there's a question about how a digital health tool should be regulated, you can always ask FDA for its guidance. With that, I'll turn it over to Mike to talk about some digital health deal considerations and diligence.
Thanks so much, Kelly. So we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to spend a couple slides on recent deal learnings and then talk a little bit more specifically on kind of trustworthy and wary on diligence and related concepts. So on deal learnings, there has been an enormous amount of time spent looking at clauses that were always important, but you don't really appreciate kind of the intricacies and the importance of certain words in light of something like COVID. So to be very specific, material adverse effect, carve-outs and language, ordinary course of conduct covenants. We've spent a lot of time looking at transactions where definitive agreements were executed and there was a period of time between signing and closing. So those are the deals that were already cut when all this happened. Contrast those to drafting new agreements for new deals de novo, in light of what we've learned and in light of the things that we have seen. So we want to spend just a few minutes talking about kind of really kind of core key takeaways from a deal perspective, and then we'll flip into due diligence and other kind of key legal topics coming out of COVID and digital health in specific. So from an MAE perspective, material adverse effect carve-outs, right? We are, and again, you have to think of it from, are you on the buy side or the sell side? But sellers are absolutely pushing for pandemics and epidemics to be excluded from an MAE definition. And the thing about MAE definitions is that, people used to rely upon them quite heavily in terms of the ability to get out of a deal. We're going to get to specific language in a minute, but that's just no longer the case. And so the key takeaway number one is when drafting or reviewing an MAE clause, you really need to consider a carefully crafted disproportionate effect qualifier as part of it, right? So is it tied to a specific industry? Are we in pharma? Are we in provider side? What is the specific industry? Are we talking about a company size? Are we talking about a specific geography? Really drilling down very specifically and granularly on what an MAE carve-out looks like. Ordinary course of business covenants, again, something that, in every deal you see them. Some people spend a lot of time on them, some people don't, but the importance of an ordinary course of business covenant is increasingly become, particularly in light of COVID, an area where there will be significant negotiation and focus. And there's multiple flavors, but there are really three key flavors to think about. One is ordinary course of business, a really objective formulation. The second is ordinary course of business consistent with past practices. That's more subjective, right? You're doing a look back. What are the past practices of the company? And then the third flavor, which is really the most restrictive, is ordinary course of business consistent with past practices, including with respect to X, Y, and Z. It could be frequency, it could be amounts, it could be product, all sorts of things. So those are just two clauses that we're seeing either litigation or increased focus from a deal perspective. And as we think about the digital health landscape and where time is being spent, we want to raise those for this group. We can go to the next slide, please. Force majeure, again, force majeure clauses are almost always interpreted very narrowly by courts. So the timing is really critical as part of this. So again, if you're looking at contracts that were signed before the outbreak of COVID-19, the pandemic may or may not be a force majeure, likely could be viewed, or you would argue would be, because it was unforeseeable. Contrast that to where we are now. New contracts, new transaction documents, new merger agreements. Specific language will be necessary for COVID-19 related circumstances and maybe COVID 2021, right? So to be considered a force majeure because circumstances are now reasonably likely at the time the contract is made to be foreseeable. So again, spending a little bit of time thinking about the force majeure clause, thinking about it from the buy side or the sell side, or even just ordinary course contracts, right? If you're a supplier, if you're a customer of the supplier, supply chain issues, those are things that, again, we're just seeing a lot of focus as part of this. If we can go to the next slide, please. The last thing I want to talk about are kind of key takeaways. One is the negotiation of specific representations regarding the impact of COVID and other pandemics. So whether it's on clinical trial enrollment, whether it's on drug product, whether it's on supply chain failures, that's point number one. Point number two is it is really easy to undercut a very specific representation with a really broadly worded phrase or phrases in a disclosure schedule. So again, depending upon what side of the fence you're on, you may have really fantastic reps that you think are really protective of you, but if you have a disclosure or disclosure schedule that is ambiguous at best, if otherwise completely undercuts or guts the specific representations you're getting, something to be certainly wary of. The second key takeaway is this relates to the MAE piece of it, which is specifically negotiating very specific closing conditions to account for supply chain or other potential risk or data risks you see, right? So oftentimes, people would either rely upon kind of broadly worded MAE clauses or other things. And the real key takeaway is objective closing conditions work. The more the merrier if you're on the receiving end of these, right? So having very specific closing conditions around very specific risks you're working about. So you don't have to close a transaction. You don't have to buy the data. You don't have to do X because there's something very specific that says you don't have to in very clear objective measure. Vague closing conditions or relying upon broadly worded MAEs can be a complete mess and oftentimes will lead to disputes, arbitration, litigation, and the like. The third piece of it is, again, if you're thinking from the sell side perspective or the buy side perspective, consider the degree of which the pandemic and the repercussions of what is going on in the world right now are priced into the deal, right? So oftentimes when there's a delta on valuation, you're going to want to have the buyer will say, well, since there's a delta on what we're talking about, let's just push it out, right? Let's use a milestone structure. Let's spread out the consideration. And so we'll have specific milestones, whether it's regulatory approval milestones or sales-based milestones or performance-based milestones. And that therefore, we'll agree to a base consideration and then we can space those out. And depending upon, again, if you're on the sell side, you're like, well, listen, you know what, that puts deal uncertainty at risk. Over 40% of all earnouts and kind of milestone-based payments are disputed at some level. And so, again, to the extent you have leverage, to send it's an auction process, really saying to the buyers, hey, you know what, let's bake that into, right? So price into the deal whatever exposure you're worried about and try to lock as much as consideration upfront and not have it be at risk. So again, in the context of digital health, we're just seeing a lot of these negotiations play out on each of these three topics. And so depending upon where you are in the universe, thinking about those as you're either looking at existing contracts you have in place or looking forward at potential infusement of capital, potential collaborations, or sell side mandates. Next slide, please, Kelly. Okay, I think I'm going to turn this over to Christine to talk a little bit about the impact of the relief funds and how we're seeing those as well.
Great, thank you, Mike. So another interesting angle and thing to think about in the context of deals in the COVID-19 environment is actually doing specific diligence around recipients of government relief funds. As most people know, in the US, there was a huge influx of federal funds that were provided to a variety of businesses to provide relief to the private sector in the context of the pandemic. So these funds were distributed across all different types of entities in the healthcare sector in particular, pursuant to certain conditions, and there was a lot of shifting guidance at the time. There were different types of providers receiving different types of funds, different requirements around those funds. And when the federal government made that big push to say, we are providing these funds, but there's requirements attached to them, they also made sure that the enforcement authorities made clear that they are going to be monitoring the use of those funds and the drawing down of those funds. And if they find fraud, they are going to prosecute it. So it's a top enforcement priority now. So you have the Department of Justice already beginning to prosecute individuals who've alleged to defraud these programs and are going to continue to do so. And the HHS OIG, for instance, the Office of Inspector General, where I used to work, has allocated millions of dollars to auditing, investigating fraud in these relief programs, and same with the Small Business Administration. So I think one thing to think about is as you're approaching, a digital health deal or a provider deal or anything in this space, really trying to figure out, okay, was this company a beneficiary of this program, pursuant to what program, and what funding stream in particular, and how did they ensure that they actually met the requirements of those funds. This harkens back a lot to the Great Recession and the Recovery Act that also pushed billions of dollars into the economy. We saw audits and investigations into those funds, 6-7 years down the line. So through all of the 2010s, even though that money was mainly distributed in 2009, 2010 timeframe. So something to keep in mind, another just diligence point that's really a shift from what we'd previously be thinking about, but in the context of COVID, it is a new concern. Next slide. So we also just want to do just an overview generally of some, the legal considerations distilled down. Kelly and I had talked about, tried to dive into some things in a little bit more particularity, but just to top line it, things you need to think about, for instance, in the consumer-facing digital health initiatives are, think about what is it related to professional clinical licensure? How do those laws, which are largely state-based, or impacting whatever digital health target you're thinking about or business that you're trying to grow. How are corporate practice of medicine or dentistry issues relevant? Pharmacy licensure, coverage and reimbursement, fraud and abuse, controlled substances, the FDA considerations that Kelly spoke to, privacy and security requirements, telehealth requirements, right? So we have, when we do diligence on companies or we are helping to advise companies on building these companies or implementing these initiatives, we have checklists in our minds of really dozens, if not hundreds of laws that we're thinking through that really could potentially impact a particular digital health company or digital health offering. So I think it's really important that when jumping into these businesses, you do the deep dive because it's not apparent, particularly if you're based in Europe and you're coming into the US space, it's not immediately apparent that you'd have all these overlapping regulatory regimes, particularly with federal and state regulations, sometimes overlapping or conflicting. So these legal considerations, they vary by initiative, but there's recurring themes that we are very well practiced in analyzing and that people need to think about. Kelly, is there anything you wanted to add on this slide?
No, Christine, go ahead. We can
Okay.
go to the next slide.
Okay, let's go to the next. Yeah, why don't you take this slide, Kelly?
Sure. Thanks, Christine. So as we've been emphasizing during the discussion today, it's critical to think about the FDA regulatory classification of the digital health technology. It's also important to consider whether the technology, the app, or whatever software it is, will be used in conjunction with a drug that's regulated by FDA. Because if that's the case, you have to be mindful not only of FDA regulatory classification and obligations related to medical devices, but also the regulatory framework that applies to use of drugs. When doing the analysis, it's also important to think about whether the digital health solution, even if it's not regulated as a medical device or subject to regulatory oversight by FDA presently, does the business have a plan to have the app evolve over time such that it would become a regulated device in the future? This may be particularly common with digital health solutions that incorporate elements of artificial intelligence. There are also issues involving the provision of value to a patient or healthcare professional, which I won't walk through here, but we've already talked about, or Christine's already talked about, some of the fraud and abuse concerns to be mindful of. It's also critical to make sure that you have any necessary patient or consumer consent, and that consent is consistent with the federal and state regulatory framework, and that you've got privacy and cybersecurity safeguards in place. We always like to consider what type of promotional review may be warranted. So although we haven't talked about it in detail during today's presentation, there are a number of FDA and FTC regulatory requirements that apply to the advertising of promotion of a particular product. You want to make sure that your communication is truthful and non-misleading. And you also want to make sure that where applicable, the communication about the digital health tool is consistent with the label of any regulated drug that may come into play. Of course, it's also important to make sure that the company's involvement is transparent, that there's nothing that could potentially create a conflict of interest with the digital health technology. And then finally, is the digital health solution being presented as an objective tool? And if so, is that an accurate representation of how the digital health solution is actually supposed to work? In the interest of time, we'll move on and now talk about some digital health growth opportunities. I'll turn it over to Mike to start that discussion.
Thanks so much, Kelly. And I think for the first time ever, we actually may be on time, which is unique. So we have 2 slides left. The last one is less interesting than this one. And we have quite a few Q&As that have been asked. I think some of them have already been addressed, but one of the questions that we received in the Q&A is, well, where are we seeing the opportunities? And slide 33 is it's not a complete list, but certainly from the types of transactions that we're getting inbound calls from, either from existing clients, potentially new clients, strategics, and financial investors, so either venture capital and or private equity. So we're seeing, again, a lot of activity on office-based specialties. So we're thinking a lot about behavioral health, quite a bit on the primary care. We talked about some primary care IPOs that occurred early in the presentation. So things that are really lending themselves to a virtual setting. We are seeing an expansion of on-demand virtual urgent care. So again, this is consistent with the telehealth trend that has been permeating throughout the presentation. Rural healthcare and expanded access for specialty care in long-term settings. Rural healthcare, not that it wasn't interesting or important, but we weren't seeing a lot of investment in there and investment dollars. That is now changing. On the flipping to the pharma side and the enabled piece of it, again, we're seeing technology-enabled critical care pathways for chronic conditions like asthma and diabetes and the like as part of the care spectrum. Seeing specialized payer offsetting for, so they'll take risk for specific disease indications, bearing the risk associated with managing those. The digital technology-enabled pathway, including remote patient monitoring for those, is absolutely critical. We're doing a lot of collaborations and licensing work between healthcare technology companies and then traditional players, right? Whether it's the providers, pharma, med device. So these are really kind of collaborations for integrated offering, use of smart devices, which Kelly touched upon, and then integrating those with the healthcare apps, which again has a regulatory framework, particularly FDA, in terms of classification, regulation, light touch or not. Value-based contracting with telehealth networks, incentivizing through the new reimbursement methodologies, whether or not they're here to stay is an open question. And again, risk contracting, I just mentioned, we're seeing kind of the offloading of certain risks for certain patient populations. Again, people swooping in and taking the risk associated with those. And if they manage that care well, money is to be made. If not, then they're bearing the risks and losses associated with those. Seeing a lot of investment in data-driven healthcare models, using data to drive prioritizing interventions for at-risk populations, and then real-world evidence that can be leveraged for research and commercial purposes. Again, this is just a flavor of the types of things that we've been seeing over the past 3 to 4 months. Looking at the time, we have 8 minutes left. Why don't we can go to the last slide, I think, Kelly, but this really just bringing home the growth numbers to the extent you're presenting to your board or otherwise. But we are quite bullish on the rest of the year, and looking ahead again, election notwithstanding, really don't see any slowdown. In fact, quite the opposite. So with that, we're going to pause, I believe, and Kelly can correct me if I have this wrong. But I think we answered quite a few of the Q&As throughout the presentation. We were seeing them real time. But I'll turn it over to others, and we'll try to be as responsive as we can in the remaining time. So thank you again.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to Kelly and Christine as well. That was fantastic. As you say, Mike, we do have a number of questions, many of which will have been answered to some degree during the presentation, but it will be good to elaborate on a few of them, I'm sure. So just to kick off, Jose Stabile has asked, what do you see as a promising activity of digital health in the context of COVID-19, specifically beyond telemedicine? I suppose that's open to any of the three of you that would be has an experience in this, or has a thought to kick off with.
This is Christine. Happy to discuss this a little bit. I think telehealth we think of a little bit as just the virtual visit that you're used to doing in person, but I think one thing that's actually quite important development is actually the shift in terms of remote patient monitoring and potentially really having that take off. So the remote patient monitoring angle, which is supported by different smart technologies and smart devices, I think is a trend that folks should pay attention to, because it's really a side angle of telehealth, but it's not what people traditionally think of. But I think for particularly all the different chronic diseases, which cause a majority of the healthcare spending, such as diabetes or COPD, other conditions like that, I really think remote patient monitoring is going to have its time to shine in the next few years.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you very much. Another anonymous attendee has asked, I head up a European digital health company. What are the biggest challenges for getting investment in the US?
I'm happy to take that one. So The answer is making sure you have your diligence kind of already completed. So the way I would typically approach that would be to sit down with a standard due diligence checklist for a digital health company in the US and use that as my guide to get the company ready for having that conversation. So we talked about a variety of the categories from either from an FDA perspective, from a data compliance perspective, from a payer perspective. It's very dependent upon the company, but what I would do is sit down with a diligence checklist. Many are publicly available. I'm sure if you shoot me your name, I'm happy to have a conversation with you about it and tailor it to your business. But I would sit down and go through that even before having a conversation with an investor, going through the due diligence exercise and seeking fundings is as much fun as having an endoscopy. And so what I would suggest doing is doing that work ahead of time, going through dry runs. What a US investor is going to be concerned about, do you understand the regulatory framework, right? Unfortunately, the US is a little bit more litigation happy than some of our colleagues outside the US. And so thinking about, from a priority perspective, where's the higher categories of risk? How are you managing that risk? Are you managing it through indemnification through contracts? Are you managing it through insurance? So I would go through the exercise, whether you're seeking 25 million or 250 million, but really going through that exercise in painful detail. And to the extent you're exposing areas where you have exposure, meaning you don't have a adequate compliance policy and procedure in place, where there is a gap, going from a US perspective to a GDPR perspective, that's where I'd be spending the time. So I don't know who the person asking the question is, but if you want to shoot me an email, happy to have a conversation off the meter with you and how to think about that.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And I suppose I want to shift to this question now, just because it's a related subject matter. Is digital health investment becoming a bubble that will soon burst?
I'm happy to take that one. Markets are in flux. I'd say that the answer to the question, I'd say no. I do think everything's a cycle. Right now, the cycle is extremely hot. There's a lot of money, but I think there has been a true paradigm shift. At some point, the IPO market will close. At some point, valuations will become too high where the strategics and private equity and other buyers will just say the prices are too high. We're going to take a pass till they come down. Part of the reason why I jumped into healthcare 21 years ago was because it's always changing, right? So all you need is that a reimbursement methodology is to change, right? You have the equivalent of HIPAA that happened many years ago. So I don't think it's a bubble per se. I'm thinking about the last time this question was asked 10 years ago, a very pretty well-known CEO was of a digital health company who I knew quite well, was on the cover of a magazine blowing a bubble in response to that question. So listen, I think for the foreseeable future, things will continue to remain quite active. I think valuations ultimately will kind of hit pause on the levels of investment. But for now, it is I'm quite bullish, and certainly will be bullish. It's certainly until the election. After the election, I don't think there'll be a seismic change, at least initially, but something that I think everyone is keeping an eye on. But welcome views from the rest of the team.
Yeah, Mike, just to add to that, I would emphasize, as Christine and I have been discussing during the presentation, that we have seen this general deregulatory trend in the digital health space. That's certainly been exacerbated by COVID-19, but we suspect that at least some of the flexibilities that federal and state governments have put into play related to digital health will persist long after the pandemic. So I think that, of course, impacts the deal-making landscape as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, guys. We do have time for one last question. And I guess seeing as reimbursement has kind of been a recurrent topic, as you might expect, I figure we'll end on this. Do you guys see the US potentially introducing a German-styled Digital Health Service Act to make reimbursement easier for digital health companies in future?
I'm happy to speak to that. I think the complex picture in the US is that we have both the federal, the state, and the private overlay in the reimbursement space, and you have certain regulations that are updated every 6 months that are literally hundreds of pages of regulations discussing how they're shifting reimbursement for what particular services in what particular context. So the US doesn't have the ability to, in one piece of legislation, shift all of its reimbursement infrastructure like that. It's just not configured in that way. But I certainly think we will continue to see both Medicare and Medicaid trying to push the bounds on the telehealth front, and then commercial payers following suit. I think at some point, commercial payers in particular, if the telehealth spend gets too out in front of them, will try to pull back. But I think there's absolutely, particularly in the context of value-based contracting, where folks are taking on risk to manage patients in a particular way, we will continue to see support. But I think it's going to be, as everything in the US healthcare and life sciences space, a fragmented march towards progress.
Excellent. That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Christine. And that is, I'm afraid, all we have time for today. So I want to say, first of all, a big thank you to everyone who joined us today. And of course, a huge thank you to Kelly, to Michael, and to Christine for sharing their experiences and their expertise with us all today. As mentioned, we will be releasing the slides to all attendees, and I'm sure today's speakers will be very happy to discuss the content of the presentation and any ways that they may be able to help you in your businesses after the webinar. We will be sending a follow-up email to everyone who is registered as soon as possible, which will include a link to the full recorded webinar. As mentioned, LSX Leaders is releasing this webinar in the run-up to Health Tech Leaders Virtual Investment and Partnering, which is taking place across the 15th to the 18th of September. The event content is free of charge, so please do sign up or get in touch with me for more of this sort of content. So thanks again to our speakers. Thank you all for joining us today, and hope very much to see you all again soon.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.